Good morning, everybody. It's another day and another devotion here at Faith Explored, and we're still looking at the principles for the kingdom. Last time we looked at thou shalt not kill, and we realized that killing doesn't only refer to you stabbing or shooting at somebody, but hating your neighbor without a cause, saying hurtful words. That is killing. And we learned that it is necessary that we reconcile with our brothers before we can present ourselves before God. And today's principle for the kingdom is one like that one. Today we look at thou shalt not commit adultery. And with me here is Zwelisha Zulu to break down this subject, a complex subject affecting many marriages, if I may say. Zweli, welcome.
Thank you, Brother Matembe. Morning to you, morning to our listeners this morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. And this is our co-founder and the brains behind this work. And we're grateful to God for the idea He has put in our minds to fulfill this work. But let's get to the matter. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So Jesus, as He's still speaking to His audience, and He still has their ears in His hands, He says, Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. That's different. I believe the audience was shocked. What is going on here? So what do you think the audience was feeling when he says these things?
Indeed. The audience must have been shocked. So I think you can begin by looking just at the verse itself. Jesus says, before He gives the command, the new reading of the command is about to give, He first says to them, Ye have heard that it was said. Meaning that He understands that He's about to introduce something new. Something that's going to be completely shock them, something that's going to be completely different from what they've heard. So this must have been shocking to them for that reason, and Jesus understands that. But it must have been shocking also for historical reasons. So we know that the Israelites at that time were under the imperial rule of the Romans. And the Romans, to put it mildly, were not known for their morals when it comes to sexuality and issues of sex.
Yeah.
So constantly they would engage in activities that were considered that we might consider as promiscuous and that offended the sensibilities of the Israelites. And so when the Israelites looked upon these acts, they looked upon themselves and compared themselves with the Romans and concluded that,
we are way better.
These people are horrible. We are much better. We are in line with the law, unlike these people. And so when now Jesus then takes this command and points it against them, He says to them, Ye have heard that this was said before, but I say unto you that you are also guilty of committing this adultery, that you've been looking at the Romans and thinking they are committing it and we are not committing.
And I'm thinking that it's the same even today.
Yes.
It's easy for me to blame someone for committing adultery. This man, he goes and sleeps with people's wives.
Yes.
That is crazy. While I look upon a woman to lust after her.
Exactly.
Jesus says I'm also guilty.
Yes. So there's this distinction that we as human beings, even as Christians, draw between the outward acts and the acts that are committed within the heart. So we tend to cleanse the outward parts and make them clean and make sure that, what we do on the outside, what people see is perfect. But when we look inside the heart, we find that, there isn't much attention that's paid to ensuring that the heart is clean. And in the case of the Pharisees, in the case of the Jews at the time, there was a historical reason for this. So if you look at the story of the Old Testament, what happened is the Jews figured out that every time they went against God's law, God would punish them in some way or another.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he would allow them to be led captive, for example, to the Babylonians. He would allow them to be punished in one way or another. And so the Pharisees then figured out that, in order to please God, in order to ensure that we are in a good relationship with God, solely just for self-preservation,
Yeah.
we're going to manifest the outward acts. We're going
Yeah.
to ensure that we keep every single letter of the law.
All right.
All the commandments that Moses had given them, more than 600 of them, he had given them, they were going to try to make sure that they keep them so that they stay out of trouble with God.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that made it so that their religion was a kind of formalism.
An outward religion.
An outward religion that paid no attention to the issues of the heart.
It's not transformative.
It was not transformative. And so the purpose of the law, as initially given by Christ in Mount Sinai to Moses, that purpose was not being fulfilled. It was changing the outward parts, but it was not changing the inward parts.
Yes.
And so that's why Christ, in the previous verses before, he says that, your righteousness needs to be much better than that of the Pharisees.
Yeah.
In fact, before that, he says, I have not come to destroy the law. I've come to fulfill it. In other words, I've come to extend its scope, to show you how far-reaching its principles are. And so that's what he's now doing. He's saying to them that I know some of you are standing here looking at the Romans, being disgusted by their practices. But the same practices are happening in your hearts. It's just that there's a lack of opportunity.
Yeah. And just, this is a weird commandment if someone listens to it. What's the problem with looking at a woman? What am I not then allowed to look at a woman?
So remember, this command, command is an extension of the command that is given earlier by Moses. So in the 10 commandments, the 7th commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Beyond that, in Leviticus, God says that if you commit adultery, it was a capital crime. In other words, it was punishable by death. So this was a serious...
And that reminds me of the woman that they brought before.
They brought before Christ, and they said, we caught her, and she must die.
And Moses said.
Moses gave us this commandment. We have the right to kill. So this is in the eyes of the Jews. Today, in the world, in the secular world, promiscuity is not something that's frowned upon that much, at least. As long as it's consenting elders and all that. In the church, it's still frowned upon, but in the secular world, it's not frowned upon. In the Jewish societies, not only was it frowned upon, but it was something that could get you to lose your life, right? And so when now Christ takes the moral weight of that command and directs it against those people who thought of themselves as being holy, as being the standard of holiness, he's really upending everything that they've thought of, that they've thought of as true up till that time.
All right.
And so what the law basically means is we must reconfigure our sensibilities. We must reconfigure our desires. We need God to work within us to change us. So you ask the question, does this now mean that you can't look at anyone?
Yeah.
The law says, do not look and lust. Of course, you'll always see people. Of course.
Yes. It says, whosoever looks to lust.
Yes.
Okay.
Whosoever looks at the woman to lust after her, to begin to desire her.
Okay.
Then that's committing adultery. You have committed it already.
Okay. So, looking at a woman, no problem. For those who are considering entering into relationships, it's okay. But the moment you start looking to lust after her, that's when you start committing adultery.
Exactly.
You shouldn't look with the idea or desire to take it further than that. One person has said that it's because you're lacking the opportunity. Had you been granted the opportunity, you would have taken her to bed. Exactly. So the issue is lusting after her. So Christ says this adultery is committed in the heart. So there's something about the heart in the Bible.
Yeah.
There's something about the heart and its relationship to sin. And dare I argue, sin begins there.
So I think it's in the book of Proverbs where the writers argue that as a man thinketh, so is he.
As a man thinketh in his heart.
In his heart, exactly, so is he. There's a point where Christ is speaking to the Pharisees, and he says unto them, they are speaking to him and they found him guilty of not washing his hands. And he says to them, it is not that which enters into the man's body that makes him unclean, but it's that which comes out of the heart. And so it's going back to this idea that Christ keeps knocking at and keeps coming back to, that it is not just about the actions that you do, the visible actions, because those might be done just to please those around you, but the righteousness needs to be embedded in your heart, and that cannot be done without the help of God. That requires total surrender to God, and I think that sort of speaks to the next topic that we wanted to discuss, which is, and if this or that offends you, you must remove it. And so it's a willingness to surrender everything to God, not part of yourself, not only the outer part, but also the inward parts, the heart, where God can take full control of your life. And so that's why the experience of conversion is usually portrayed as a rebirth. Christ is speaking to Nicodemus and says, you must be born again. There must be a total renewal from within that is then portrayed outside.
So we work from inside
from
out,
inside
not from
out,
outside.
not from outside in, because that could just be, I mean, anyone can pretend for a few days or a few years, but to be renewed from within is only something that Christ can do, and only he can renew human hearts.
All right. And on that note, Proverbs mentions again, guard your heart with all due diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.
Exactly.
So we see the importance of the heart. We see the importance of the heart. And you had touched on this point, the one we're moving on to. In verse 29, Christ then continues and says, and that is to say, attached to what I just said, right? And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And he says, and if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And that sounds interesting. Are you saying, okay, because for me, when I see a lady, that's where I'm affected. Should I then remove my eyes? For me, when I touch a certain substance, after I touch that, I move on and on and on. Should I then remove my hand so that I don't touch that? What? Or when I listen to particular music, when I hear certain gossip, it arouses in me certain things. Should I then remove my ears, eardrums, and all those elements so that I can be free from sin? What is Christ saying?
So Christ here is not requesting of us to literally go to the surgery and amputate ourselves for the sake of the kingdom. No such requirement is given. We know this because none of his disciples were ever required to do that. Right? Even after he had left, there was no such command. People such as Peter, who did commit some sins.
He cut someone's ear. He had to cut that hand out. Hey?
Yeah, he must have. But Christ gives no command. So what Christ is saying here is, the lesson, simply put, summarized, is that we ought to be willing to surrender everything that might be a hindrance to us getting into the kingdom of heaven. No matter how important. So it's interesting that Christ picks the most important members of the body, without which we cannot function.
Yeah.
Not just the hand, but the right hand. Not just the eye, but your right eye. So these are, Christ could have picked other members of the body that it might be easier to function without. But he picks the hand, the eye. These are important inputs that we use to function in the world. And he says, if that offends you, you must be willing to give it up for the kingdom of heaven.
All right.
And so Christ here is calling his people, or the people that are listening to him, to a willingness to surrender everything. In another case, Christ says to his disciples that if any man will come after me, let him deny himself. Let him take up his cross. Let him follow me. So there's actually some interesting comment that's given on that front, that if usually when people were crucified, this is during the times of the Roman Empire, when people were crucified, it was a grueling, cruel process. They were unwilling. They knew that they were going to die long, painful death, and they were unwilling to take up their crosses and be crucified. Usually they had to be compelled by a lot of soldiers until they finally have no choice but to be on that cross and to suffer for as long as they would suffer until they die. Christ then takes that imagery and says, you as a Christian, knowing the many sacrifices that you might have to take, you have to be willing. Take up the cross, willingly bear it, and follow me. In other words, be willing to surrender every single thing that you have to surrender in order to attain this kingdom that I'm speaking to you about.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we have touched on everything. It is important for us to realize that sin is not only outward. It starts within us.
Exactly.
And we need to fix the inside before we can portray that righteousness. And then again, as we have mentioned, we need to be willing to sacrifice, be willing to lose out on all those things for the sake of the kingdom. Because what Christ says is, this person goes to hell, while they had the opportunity to be saved. They had the opportunity to be saved, but then they lose their whole body in hell because they couldn't sacrifice just a portion. Thank you so much, Zweli, for discussing with me on this matter. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Be blessed. Faith explored, where every question is a step closer to understanding.